The fog that November evening lay thick upon London, muffling the great city in its grey embrace. At 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, contemplating the criminal underworld. Then came the knock, urgent, desperate. The visitor brought news of murder at Parliament Square. Lord Harrington lay dead under mysterious circumstances. Scotland Yard called it suicide. But the misplaced ink blot told Holmes a different tale entirely. The game, as he remarked to Watson, was afoot, and before the fog lifted, the truth would be revealed. Chapter 1. The Urgent Visitor. Sherlock Holmes lounged in his purple dressing gown, legs stretched toward the coal fire whose warm glow fought the chill seeping through the frosted window panes. The room smelled strongly of shag tobacco, and the faint chemical bite of his latest experiment still lingering on the cluttered table. Dr. John Watson sat opposite, nursing a cup of hot tea whose steam carried the comforting aroma of assam, though the bitter taste remained on his tongue. Outside, the muffled clatter of hansom cab wheels rolled over wet cobbles, and every now and then the deep chime of big band penetrated the fog like a warning. Mrs. Hudson's light footsteps ascended the stairs, followed by the heavier tread of a man in boots. She opened the door and announced, "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen." Lestrade entered, bringing with him the dank smell of Thames mud and damp wool from his overcoat. He stamped his feet, scattering droplets across the worn Turkey carpet, and rubbed his gloved hands together against the cold night air. "Amar, Holmes," he began in his usual brisk, slightly defensive tone. "Scotland Yard has a delicate matter on its hands. Lord Reginald Harrington, member for West Surrey, was found dead this afternoon in his private office overlooking Parliament Square. Pistol beside him, powder burns on the temple. Suicide note on the desk confessing to taking bribes. Case appears straightforward." Holmes set his clay pipe down carefully on the small table, the smooth bowl still warm in his palm. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin and regarded Lestrade with half-closed eyes. "Straightforward," he repeated softly, the word dripping with quiet skepticism. "And yet you are here, Inspector, at this hour in the fog. Pray continue." Lestrade cleared his throat. The office was locked from the inside. Key still in the lock. No signs of forced entry. The note is in his own handwriting, or so it appears. He admits accepting money to influence the colonial trade bill. Quite damning. Watson leaned forward, medical instinct stirring. "Was there any indication of struggle, Inspector? Any marks on the body beyond the wound?" "None that we could see," Lestrade replied. "Body discovered by a secretary, Mr. Elias Thorne, just after 3 o'clock. Fire nearly out. Room cold as a crypt. Smelled of gunpowder and cigar smoke." Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace, his slippered feet whispering over the coarse rug. "Describe the note's position," he demanded. "Laid neatly on the blotter, folded once. Ink still slightly wet in one corner." Holmes stopped. "Wet?" "A small blot, yes." "Splattered." Holmes' eyes gleamed. He crossed to the mantel, took his magnifying lens, and returned to stand before Lestrade. "Show me your boots, Inspector." Lestrade hesitated, then lifted one foot. Holmes dropped to one knee, lens in hand, examining the sole with intense concentration. The rough leather was streaked with reddish clay mixed with fine coal dust. Embedded in the tread were tiny fibers of jute and a faint smear of deep blue ink. "Reddish clay and coal dust," Holmes murmured rapidly. "Not common Westminster mud. This is characteristic of the narrow alley behind the gasworks near Parliament Square, where clerks frequently discard waste paper. And this ink, Prussian blue with a distinctive watermark trace. Not the standard parliamentary variety." He rose swiftly. The note was written by a left-handed person. The splatter pattern shows the characteristic arc of a southpaw. Lord Harrington, however, was right-handed. I observed the callus on his right middle finger when we met at the Athenaeum last year. Watson exhaled slowly. "Then you believe?" "I believe," Holmes said, voice sharp and precise, "that someone staged a suicide to silence a man who knew too much. Someone who walked through that alley today, handled forged documents, and then placed the pistol. The ink blot was no accident. It was overlooked in haste." Lestrade bristled. "Now see here, Mr. Holmes, Scotland Yard." Holmes cut him off with a wave. "The suspect's inspector." Quickly, Lestrade sighed. Sir Edmund Blackwood, his chief rival in the House, bitter opponent of the bill. Lady Harrington, the wife, rumored to be in financial difficulties. Mr. Elias Thorne, the secretary who discovered the body. Mr. Victor Langford, a journalist who threatened exposure last week. And Count Victor Drakov, the foreign diplomat with heavy interests in the colonial trade affected by the bill. Holmes nodded once. "We shall visit the scene immediately." They left 221B in a hansom, the cab swaying through the thick fog. The horses' hooves clopped rhythmically, wheels grinding over stones. The air outside carried the pungent odor of horse manure, coal smoke, and the distant salt tang of the river. Inside the cab, Holmes sat silent, fingers drumming on his knee, while Watson felt the rough wool of his coat against his neck and the chill that refused to leave his bones. They reached Parliament Square. Gas lamps burned feebly in the mist, their light hallowed. The office door stood guarded by a constable who stepped aside at Lestrade's word. Inside, the room was cold, the fire dead in the grate. The scent of spent cordite still hung in the air, overlaid with stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The body had been removed, but a dark stain remained on the carpet. Holmes moved directly to the desk. He bent low, lens in hand, studying the blotter. "Observe, Watson," he said, voice low and intense. "The splatter shows a left-handed flourish. And here," he pointed to a tiny fiber caught in the ink, jute from a document bag, the same fiber on Lestrade's boot. "Someone carried papers from that alley into this room after the murder." He straightened, eyes bright. "Not suicide, gentlemen. Murder most deliberate. And the corruption Lord Harrington confessed to? Merely the bait to disguise the true motive." The fog horns moaned in the distance. Big Ben struck the quarter hour. Holmes turned to Watson with a faint, predatory smile. "The game, my dear Watson," he said quietly, "is most decidedly afoot." Chapter 2. Shadows in the fog. The hansom cab rattled through the thickening November fog, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding wet cobbles with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Inside, Sherlock Holmes sat motionless, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, gray eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the misted glass. The air carried the sharp bite of his shag tobacco mingled with the damp wool of Watson's overcoat and the faint, sour whiff of horse manure drifting in from the street. Watson shifted, feeling the rough texture of the leather seat against his palms, the chill of the night still clinging to his bones despite the small brazier glowing at their feet. They alighted first at Harrington's office in Parliament Square. The gas lamps burned dull yellow halos in the fog. Big Ben struck the half-hour with deep, muffled chimes. A constable saluted Lestrade and stepped aside. Inside, the room remained cold as a tomb. The dead fire in the grate gave off only the faintest smell of old coal smoke. The metallic tang of blood lingered beneath the stronger odor of spent gunpowder and stale cigar ash. Holmes moved straight to the desk. He bent low, magnifying lens in hand, studying the suicide note once more. "Observe, Watson," he said rapidly, voice low and precise. "The ink has dried unevenly. Here, in the lower left corner, a fresh splatter, still faintly tacky to the touch. Yet the rest of the document is dry. Someone returned to this room after the body was discovered." Watson frowned. "Returned? But the door was locked from the inside." "Precisely. And yet," Holmes pointed to a tiny shred of jute fiber caught in a crack of the blotter, "this matches the fibers on Lestrade's boot. Document bags used by parliamentary clerks are made of exactly this coarse material. Someone carried papers from the alley behind the gasworks into this room after 3 o'clock. He straightened, eyes bright. "We begin with the secretary." Mr. Elias Thorne waited in the small antechamber next door. The air smelled of ink, cheap tobacco, and nervous sweat. Thorne was a thin, pale man in his late 30s, fingers stained with blue-black ink. He rose jerkily as they entered. "M.R. Holmes, sir," he began in a low Cockney accent, voice unsteady. "I swear I found him just like that. Door locked, key in the lock. I knocked, no answer. Used my spare key. Then, there he was. Holmes studied the man's boots. Same reddish clay, same coal dust. You walked through the gasworks alley this afternoon, Mr. Thorne? Thorne blinked. I often cut through there. Shorter route from my lodgings. And the ink on your fingers, Holmes continued, is the same Prussian blue used on the note. Yet you claim you never touched the document. I didn't. I only touched the door handle, the telephone receiver. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Telephone? In this building? Thorne flushed. No, sir. I meant the speaking tube to the outer office. Holmes gave a small, satisfied nod and turned away without another word. Next they took a four-wheeler to Belgravia. Lady Harrington received them in a drawing-room heavy with the scent of lavender and beeswax polish. A coal fire crackled warmly. The chill outside seemed far away. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, dressed in deep mourning silk that rustled softly as she moved. M.R. Holmes, she said in a controlled, aristocratic voice, I come to you in the strictest confidence. My husband's reputation, our family's name must be protected at all costs. He was not a man who would take his own life. Holmes inclined his head. The note confesses to accepting bribes, madam. Did you know of any such transactions? She hesitated. He spoke once of difficulties. Investments in the colonies had gone badly. But bribery? I cannot believe it. Watson noticed her hands tremble slightly as she clasped them in her lap. On the small table beside her chair lay a lace handkerchief with a faint brown stain. Thames mud, unmistakable. Holmes observed it too, but said nothing. Instead he asked, Did your husband smoke Turkish cigarettes? No, only Cuban cigars. Thank you, Lady Harrington. Their next call was to Sir Edmund Blackwood's chambers near Whitehall. The corridors smelled of horse manure from the mews below, and the sharp tang of fresh ink from copying clerks. Sir Edmund, tall and silver-haired, greeted them with icy courtesy. M.R. Holmes, this is absurd. I opposed Harrington's bill, yes, vehemently. But murder. Scotland Yard knows my movements. I was in committee all afternoon. Holmes' gaze flicked to the ashtray on the desk, a small pile of gray. Flaky ash remained, Turkish tobacco. You smoke Turkish blend, Sir Edmund? Occasionally. What of it? Holmes merely smiled thinly. By the time they returned to Baker Street, the fog had grown so dense that the gas lamps along the street looked like floating orbs. Mrs. Hudson had kept the fire burning. The warm scent of coal and the faint sweetness of her baking drifted up the stairs. Holmes dropped into his armchair, lit his pipe, and exhaled a long plume of smoke. Watson watched him. What do you make of it all, Holmes? Holmes spoke slowly, almost dreamily. 3 distinct tobacco ashes at the scene. Harrington's Cuban, Blackwood's Turkish, and a third trace, Latakia, rare and expensive, almost certainly Count Dracov's. The jute fiber links the alley to the office. The ink splatter speaks of forgery. And the mud. The mud tells us someone walked from the gasworks to Parliament Square and then to this very room after the murder. He leaned forward suddenly, eyes gleaming. The corruption was real, Watson. But the suicide is a fiction. A careful fiction designed to bury one scandal beneath a greater one. Watson felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. Then who? Holmes tapped ash from his pipe into the grate. The coal settled with a soft crackle. That, my dear Watson, he said quietly, we shall discover before the fog lifts tomorrow. Outside, the fog horns moan mournfully across the river. Chapter 3. The Crimson Clue. The fog had thickened overnight, turning Parliament Square into a world of gray shadows and muffled sounds. By mid-morning, Holmes and Watson returned to Lord Harrington's private office, accompanied by reluctant Inspector Lestrade. The cold air inside still carried the faint metallic tang of dried blood, overlaid now with the stale smell of old coal smoke and the sharp, acrid bite of carbolic soap the police had used in their cursory cleaning. Big Ben struck 11. Each deep chime seemed to vibrate through the thick stone walls. Holmes moved at once to the desk, his long coat brushing the carpet. He produced his magnifying lens and bent low, studying the suicide note with fierce concentration. The paper rustled softly under his fingers. Observe Watson, he said rapidly, voice tight with excitement. The ink has dried unevenly across the page. Here, in the lower flourish of the signature, a small, fresh splatter remains faintly tacky to the touch. The rest of the document is bone dry. Someone handled this paper after the body was discovered. Watson frowned, peering over Holmes' shoulder. But the room was locked. The key was still in the lock on the inside. Precisely, Holmes replied without looking up. And yet, he pointed to a tiny shred of coarse jute fiber caught in a crack beside the inkwell. This fiber matches the ones embedded in the reddish clay on Lestrade's boot. Parliamentary clerks use document bags of exactly this material. Someone carried papers from the alley behind the gasworks into this room after 3 o'clock yesterday. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. We've already searched the safe and drawers, Mr. Holmes. Nothing missing that we can see. Holmes ignored him. He moved to the small safe set into the wall behind the desk. The lock showed minute scratches, almost invisible to the naked eye. He examined them closely, lens in hand. These are fresh, he murmured. Made with a fine steel pick, not a key. And here, he scraped a few microscopic filings from the lock plate onto a clean glass slide. Cold metal shavings, still bright. Recent work. He turned next to the carpet beneath the desk. Kneeling, he scraped at the dried bloodstain with the tip of his penknife. The texture was coarse and flaking. Watson watched with professional interest as Holmes lifted a small sample. The blood is splattered in a pattern inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound at close range, Holmes observed. The angle is raw. The pistol was held at least 18 inches from the temple, farther than a man's arm can comfortably reach when firing upon himself. Watson nodded slowly. I noticed that yesterday. The powder burns are too light for contact discharge. Holmes rose and crossed to the window. He examined the sill. A thin line of reddish mud remained where someone had rested a hand or knee. This mud, he said, contains the same coal dust and clay as the alley behind the gasworks. And here, he pointed to a single dark haircut on the rough wooden frame. Latakia tobacco strong, distinctive scent. Count Drakov is known to smoke only this rare blend. Lestrade cleared his throat. You're building quite a case, Mr. Holmes, but we still have no direct link. Holmes cut him off with a sharp gesture. He returned to the desk and lifted the heavy crystal inkwell. Beneath it lay a small, folded scrap of blotting paper. He unfolded it carefully. Ah, he breathed. Here is the key. The blotting paper showed a reversed impression of writing, clear enough to read under strong light. The words were fragments. Payment received. Drakov. Silence. Essential. And beneath, in a different hand, a single line. The thumb is scarred from the engraver's tool. Holmes' eyes flashed. A forger's scar. I've seen such marks twice before. Once on the hand of the Lambeth counterfeiter in '87, and again on the forger who produced the false treaty documents in the Grosvenor Square affair. The pressure of the burin over years leaves a distinctive diagonal cut across the left thumb. He turned to Lestrade. Amar. Thorne, the secretary, is left-handed. He has ink stains on the fingers of his left hand, and he walked through the gasworks alley yesterday. Watson exhaled slowly. Then Thorne forged the note. Not alone, Holmes said. Someone else provided the template. Someone with access to Harrington's genuine handwriting. And someone else still arranged the murder itself, using fine-grained continental gunpowder not sold in England. He paced the room once, slippers whispering over the carpet. The corruption was real, gentlemen. Harrington was taking bribes to push the colonial trade bill through Parliament. But when he threatened to confess everything, perhaps to save himself, he became a liability. They killed him, forged a suicide note confessing only part of the truth, and staged the scene to discredit him completely. Lestrade rubbed his chin. Blackwood? Drakov? Lady Harrington? All three have motives, Holmes replied. And all three have left traces in this room. Turkish ash, Latakia tobacco, Thames mud on a handkerchief. But the forger's scar points directly to Thorne. He is the weak link. He closed his lens with a decisive snap. We have the physical evidence, Watson. Mud, fibers, ink, ash, blood pattern, lock scratches. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The fog horns moaned again across the river. Rain began to patter softly against the window panes. Holmes turned to the fire, which Lestrade had just coaxed back to life. The warm glow cast long shadows across the room. "Crime wears many masks, Watson," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But it always leaves material traces, small, stubborn, scientific traces. And those traces never lie." He stared into the flames for a long moment. Then, very softly, he added, "Before this fog lifts, we shall have the entire web." Chapter 4. False Trails and Sudden Danger. The fog had lifted slightly by late afternoon, but a thin gray veil still hung over London, turning the gas lamps into pale, glowing orbs. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson left Parliament Square in a hansom cab, the iron-rimmed wheels clattering sharply over the damp cobbles. The air outside carried the heavy scent of coal smoke from a dozen chimneys and the faint, sour tang of horse manure drifting up from the streets. Inside the cab, Holmes sat rigid, fingers steepled beneath his chin, while Watson felt the rough wool of his overcoat against his neck and the lingering chill of the cold office still clinging to his bones. "Our first task," Holmes said abruptly, "is to test the alibis." They began with Sir Edmund Blackwood. The hansom drew up outside his imposing residence in Mayfair. The front door opened to reveal a butler whose polished shoes reflected the gaslight. Inside, the hall smelled of beeswax polish and the faint, sweet smoke of Cuban cigars. Sir Edmund received them in the library, where a coal fire crackled warmly, casting long shadows across shelves of leather-bound volumes. "Omar." "Holmes," Blackwood said in his clipped, aristocratic tone, "I have already told Inspector Lestrade everything. I was in committee from noon until 4. 20 witnesses can confirm it." Holmes' gaze flicked to the ashtray on the desk, a small pile of gray, flaky Turkish tobacco ash. "You smoke Turkish blend, Sir Edmund?" "Occasionally." "What of it?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Nothing at all. Merely an observation." As they left, Holmes murmured to Watson, "His alibi is solid, too solid. He was in committee, yes, but he left briefly at 2:30. I noticed the clock in the hall was stopped at that hour. Someone reset it." Next they went to the offices of the journalist, Mr. Victor Langford, in Fleet Street. The building reeked of ink, damp newsprint, and stale coffee. Langford met them in a cluttered room lit by a single gas jet. Papers rustled constantly as clerks hurried past the open door. "I warned Harrington I'd expose him," Langford said defiantly, his voice carrying a strong Cockney edge. "He was taking bribes. Everyone knew it. But murder? Not me." Holmes examined the man's hands. No ink stains, no calluses from forgery work. But on the desk lay a single cigarette butt, Turkish tobacco, still faintly warm. "You smoke Turkish?" Holmes asked. Langford shrugged. "Sometimes." "Why?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he bent to study a scrap of paper half hidden beneath the ledger. It was a receipt for a typewriter ribbon and carbon paper, purchased that very morning. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "A journalist who suddenly needs typewriter supplies on the day of a murder." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You think he forged the note?" "Not he," Holmes replied, "but he may have supplied the materials." Their next call was to Count Victor Drakov's embassy in Belgrave Square. The building was grand, the air inside thick with the scent of exotic spices, incense, and the strong, pungent aroma of Latakia tobacco. The Count received them in a richly furnished drawing room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Ah, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said in a smooth, accented voice, "your reputation precedes you, but I warn you, interfere in diplomatic matters at your peril." Holmes inclined his head. "I merely wish to know where you were yesterday afternoon, Count." "In my embassy, naturally. I had guests. Diplomatic guests." Holmes' eyes narrowed. On the carpet near the Count's chair lay a single dark hair, Latakia tobacco clinging to it, and on the mantelpiece stood a small silver box containing fine-grained gunpowder, Continental manufacture, the same type used in Harrington's pistol. Holmes' voice was very soft. "You collect unusual souvenirs, Count." Drakov smiled thinly. "A harmless hobby." As they left the embassy, Holmes paused on the steps. The fog had thickened again. The street lamps glowed like distant moons. "We are being followed," he said quietly. Watson glanced back. A dark figure melted into the shadows. "Thorn?" he whispered. "No, someone else. Larger. More dangerous." They walked quickly toward a narrow alley off Belgrave Square. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the wet stone walls. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy overcoat and a low-crowned hat pulled down over his eyes. "M.R. Holmes," the man said in a low, rough voice. "You've been asking too many questions." Holmes stopped. His hand slipped inside his coat. "And you have been sent to silence me?" The man laughed once, a harsh bark. "Not silence. Just a warning." He lunged. Holmes sidestepped smoothly, his single stick flashing from beneath his coat. The wood cracked sharply against the man's wrist. The attacker grunted and stumbled back. Watson drew his revolver, but the man was already retreating into the fog. Holmes lowered the stick. "A hired thug." "But whose?" They hurried back to the main street. The fog horns moaned across the river. Big Ben struck 6, each chime deep and solemn. "Our theories are converging," Holmes said as they climbed into another hansom. "Blackwood's alibi is false. Langford supplied materials. Drakov owns the gunpowder. And someone, almost certainly Thorn, forged the note. But there is a deeper layer. Someone is coordinating them all." Watson felt the cold metal of his revolver against his palm. "Who?" Holmes stared out into the fog. "The corruption runs higher than we thought. Harrington was about to expose not just bribes, but a conspiracy to sell state secrets to a foreign power. They killed him to silence him, and forged the suicide note to make him appear guilty, discrediting his accusations before they could be made." The cab rattled on through the mist. Holmes' voice was very quiet. "We are close, Watson. But the final piece is still missing." Behind them, in the fog, footsteps followed, soft, persistent, and growing nearer. Chapter 6. The Hidden Alliance. By early evening, the fog had returned in force, wrapping London in a damp, choking shroud. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson sat once again in the familiar warmth of their Baker Street sitting room. The coal fire crackled steadily. Its orange glow pushed back the chill that pressed against the window panes. The air carried the comforting scent of shag tobacco from Holmes' pipe, mingled with the faint aroma of Mrs. Hudson's fresh baked scones cooling on the sideboard. Big Ben struck 7. Each deep note rolled through the mist like a distant warning. Holmes lounged in his armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Watson sat opposite, nursing a glass of hot brandy whose sweet warmth spread slowly through his chest. A small stack of telegrams and documents lay scattered on the low table between them, evidence gathered over the past frantic days. Holmes spoke first, voice calm, but edged with certainty. "The threads are clear now, Watson. We have moved beyond suspicion to certainty." He reached for the topmost document, a ledger page seized from Count Drakov's embassy the previous night. This record shows payments, substantial payments, made over the last 18 months to Lord Harrington. The handwriting is in Thorn's left hand, the same distinctive pressure and slight tremor we saw in the forged suicide note. But the amounts are far greater than any mere parliamentary bribe. Watson leaned forward. Then Harrington was not merely accepting money to influence the colonial trade bill. No, he was selling information. Detailed reports on British naval dispositions in the Indian Ocean, troop movements in Afghanistan, information that could only have come from the War Office itself. Harrington had access through his position on the Colonial Committee. Holmes tapped another sheet, and here, receipts for fine-grained Continental gunpowder, purchased in Ostend and shipped under diplomatic seal. The same powder that killed him. Drakov's signature appears on the customs declaration. Watson exhaled slowly. So the Count supplied the murder weapon, and Blackwood supplied the motive and the cover. Holmes continued. Blackwood opposed the bill publicly, fiercely. He made himself the perfect foil. While everyone watched the rivalry between the two men, the real alliance was formed in secret. Blackwood's Turkish tobacco ash in the office, Drakov's Latakia on the sill, Thorne's forger scar, and jute fibers from the document bag all converge here. He rose and began to pace slowly before the fire, the floorboards creaking softly under his slippers. The method was elegant in its ruthlessness. First, they attempted to silence Harrington with poison. Traces of arsenic were found in the dregs of his teacup, overlooked by Lestrade's men. When that failed, perhaps he suspected and refused to drink, they resorted to the pistol. The shot was fired at close range by Thorne, who had access to the room. Blackwood reset the clock in the committee room to cover the time of the murder. Drakov provided the powder and the diplomatic immunity to smuggle it. Watson frowned. But why stage the suicide note at all? Why not simply make it look like a robbery gone wrong? Because, Holmes replied, stopping to face the fire. The confession was essential. By confessing to bribes in his own apparent handwriting, Harrington would be discredited forever. Any accusation he might have made against the real conspirators, against Blackwood, against Drakov, would be dismissed as the ravings of a guilty man trying to shift blame. It was a double murder, of the body and of the reputation. A log settled in the grate with a soft crackle. Holmes turned, eyes bright in the firelight. I have seen this pattern before, Watson. In the Grosvenor Square treaty forgery of '89, a diplomat and a junior clerk conspired to sell secrets to a foreign power. The clerk forged documents, the diplomat provided the means, and a third man, seemingly a rival, created the public distraction. I traced it then by the same trifles. Tobacco ash, ink composition, a single fiber caught in a lock. The material evidence never lies. He sat again, picking up his pipe. Criminal methodology follows patterns because human nature follows patterns. Greed, fear, ambition, these are constant. The technique varies only in detail. Here we have forgery to mask treason, staged suicide to bury the truth, and a false rivalry to blind the world. But every actor leaves his mark. The forger's scarred thumb, the smoker's ash, the smuggler's powder. Watson nodded slowly. And observation, deduction, logic, these are the instruments that strip away the mask. Exactly, Holmes said quietly. When you have eliminated the impossible, suicide, robbery, accident, whatever remains, however improbable, is the truth. In this case, the improbable truth is that three men of power and position conspired together to murder one of their own and sell their country's secrets. He leaned back, exhaling a long plume of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. Crime is a puzzle, Watson. Each piece is physical, stubborn, scientific. Assemble them correctly, and the picture is undeniable. Outside, the foghorns moaned across the river, low and mournful. Rain began to tap softly against the panes. Holmes stared into the flames for a long moment, then spoke again, almost to himself. The web is revealed. The strands of greed, betrayal, and murder are laid bare. And tomorrow, when we confront them, the tapestry will unravel thread by thread. He set his pipe down with a decisive click. The end is near, Watson, and the truth, as always, will be merciless. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The following morning dawned cold and clear, the first in many days without the smothering fog. A pale winter sun filtered through the tall windows of Lord Harrington's private office in Parliament Square. Sherlock Holmes stood beside the desk, hands clasped behind his back, while Dr. Watson waited near the fireplace. The room still carried faint traces of the tragedy. The metallic ghost of gunpowder, the stale sweetness of old cigar smoke, and the lingering smell of coal ash from the rekindled grate. Big Ben struck 9. Each chime rang with unusual clarity through the crisp air. Inspector Lestrade had arranged the gathering at Holmes' request. Present were Sir Edmund Blackwood, Count Victor Drakov, Mr. Elias Thorne. Standing a little apart, Lady Harrington, pale but composed. 2 burly constables waited just outside the door. Holmes spoke without preamble, his voice calm, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. Gentlemen and madam, you have been summoned here because the evidence is now complete. There is no longer any need for conjecture. The murder of Lord Reginald Harrington was no suicide, nor the act of a lone, desperate man. It was a conspiracy executed with care and carried out by the 3 of you. He turned first to Thorne. M.R. Thorne, You are the weakest link. You forged the suicide note. Your left-handed script produced the characteristic splatter we found still tacky on the page. The jute fibers from your document bag were caught in the inkwell and on the carpet. Your scarred left thumb, clearly visible now as you clench your hands, matches the impression left on the blotting paper beneath inkstand. You purchased the typewriter ribbon and carbon paper used to practice Harrington's hand, and you fired the fatal shot. Thorne's face drained of color. His voice cracked. I had no choice. They threatened me. Holmes raised a hand. Save your explanations for the doc. He turned to Blackwood. Sir Edmund, your role was a public distraction. You staged the bitter rivalry, making certain everyone saw you as Harrington's enemy. But you were his silent partner. You reset the committee room clock to cover the time of the murder. Your Turkish tobacco ash was found beside the body, ash you left deliberately to reinforce the appearance of conflict. You also provided the template of Harrington's genuine handwriting for Thorne to copy. Blackwood's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again without speaking. Finally, Holmes faced the Count. Count Drakov, you were the architect. You supplied the Continental gunpowder, purchased in Ostend under diplomatic seal. You arranged the initial attempt at poisoning with arsenic in Harrington's tea. When that failed, you authorized the pistol. Your Latakia tobacco hair was caught on the windowsill. Your ledger records the payments for information sold to you, information that would have crippled British interests in the colonies. You intended to use Harrington's death to bury any accusation he might have made against you. The Count smiled thinly, though his eyes were cold. You have imagination, Mr. Holmes. But imagination is not evidence. Holmes stepped to the desk and laid out the items one by one, each movement deliberate. Evidence, Count. 1. The forged note, with Thorne's scarred thumbprint visible under magnification. 2. The jute fibers linking Thorne's bag to the scene. 3. The Turkish ash from Sir Edmund's preferred blend. 4. The Latakia hair and the gunpowder of Ostend manufacture, both traceable to your embassy. 5. The ledger entries showing payments signed in your own hand. 6. The arsenic residue in the teacup, confirmed by chemical analysis in my laboratory this morning. He paused. When you have eliminated the impossible, suicide, random robbery, personal vengeance, what remains is the truth. A conspiracy of 3 men to murder one who threatened to expose them. Silence fell, thick and heavy. The fire crackled. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past. Lady Harrington spoke first, voice trembling but clear. Then my husband was betrayed by those he trusted. Holmes inclined his head. Deeply, madam. But his death will not be in vain. The truth will be known. Lestrade stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. Sir Edmund Blackwood, Count Victor Drakov, Mr. Elias Thorne, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Lord Reginald Harrington and for conspiracy to commit treason. Blackwood lunged suddenly toward the door. One of the constables caught him by the arm. The other seized Thorne, who offered no resistance. Drakov stood motionless, face expressionless as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. As they were led away, Drakov paused at the threshold and looked back at Holmes. You have won this round, Mr. Holmes, he said softly. But empires are not felled by one man's death or one detective's cleverness. Holmes met his gaze without blinking. Perhaps not. But justice begins with one thread pulled free. The door closed behind them. Watson exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. It's over then. Holmes stared at the empty doorway for a long moment. Not quite. The trial remains. But the web is broken. He turned to Lady Harrington. Your husband's reputation will be restored, madam. The confession was a forgery. The bribes were real, but they were part of a larger treason he intended to expose. His death was the price of his belated courage. Tears stood in her eyes. She inclined her head in silent gratitude. Holmes crossed to the window and looked out over Parliament Square. The winter sun glinted on the wet stones. A few pigeons rose into the pale sky. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. Elementary, my dear Watson. A faint smile touched Watson's lips. The game was ended. Chapter 8. Shadows of Justice. The pale winter sun had barely risen above the spires of Westminster when the heavy doors of Scotland Yard closed behind the three prisoners. Inside the echoing corridors, the air smelled strongly of carbolic soap, old ink, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil from the constable's belts. Inspector Lestrade led the way to a small interview room where a single gas lamp burned steadily on the wall. The room was cold. Frost still clung to the narrow window high above the desk. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson followed in silence. Holmes carried a thin leather portfolio containing the physical evidence. Watson held a small medical bag in case any of the accused required attention. The constables remained outside, their boots scraping softly against the stone floor. Lestrade closed the door and faced Holmes. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, his usual defensiveness softened by grudging respect. "You've given us quite a case. The commissioner wants everything presented before noon. Let's see what you've got." Holmes laid the portfolio on the desk and opened it with deliberate care. He arranged the items in a neat row. The forged suicide note, the stained blotting paper, a glass slide bearing the jute fibers, small envelopes containing tobacco ash samples, a vial of Continental gunpowder, and a single dark hair sealed in wax paper. "These are the material proofs," Holmes began, voice calm and precise. "First, the note. Chemical analysis shows the ink is Prussian blue adulterated with a Continental additive not used in British parliamentary offices. The handwriting pressure and splatter pattern indicate a left-handed writer. Mr. Thorne is left-handed. Under magnification, the impression on the blotting paper beneath reveals the characteristic diagonal scar across the left thumb, produced by years of handling engraving tools. Thorne's thumb bears this exact mark." Lestrade nodded slowly. "We've taken his prints. The match is clear." Holmes moved to the next item. The jute fibers. These coarse strands were caught in the inkwell and on the carpet near the body. They matched the document bags used by parliamentary clerks. Thorne's lodgings contained 3 such bags, one of which still bore traces of the same reddish clay found on his boots and on the window sill of the office. He picked up the small envelopes of ash, 3 distinct tobaccos at the seam. Lord Harrington smoked only Cuban cigars. Sir Edmund Blackwood prefers Turkish blend, gray, flaky, highly aromatic. Count Drakov uses only Latakia, dark and pungent. The Latakia hair on the sill was still clinging to a trace of the same tobacco. The Turkish ash was deliberately left near the body to reinforce the appearance of a violent quarrel between rivals. Lestrade rubbed his chin. "And the gunpowder?" Holmes tapped the vial. "Fine-grained, Ostend manufacture. Shipped under diplomatic seal. The customs declaration bears Drakov's signature. The same powder was used in the pistol found beside the body. The barrel was cleaned after firing, but microscopic residue remained." He lifted the final envelope containing the dark hair. "This hair was caught on the rough wooden frame of the window. It carries Latakia scent and a trace of the same gunpowder. The Count's valet has confirmed that Drakov habitually strokes his mustache after smoking." Watson spoke quietly. "There's also the matter of the arsenic. Traces were found in the dregs of Lord Harrington's afternoon tea. The amount was not immediately fatal, but it would have weakened him considerably, making the pistol shot seem more plausible as self-inflicted." Lestrade exhaled. "It's a tight case, Mr. Holmes. Very tight." Holmes closed the portfolio with a soft snap. "There are loose ends to tie. Lady Harrington was unaware of the depth of her husband's involvement. She believed the financial difficulties were merely poor investments. She will testify to that effect. Mr. Victor Langford, the journalist, purchased typewriter supplies on the day of the murder, but only because Blackwood instructed him to, under threat of exposure of Langford's own gambling debts. He will give evidence against Blackwood." Lestrade nodded. "We've already taken statements from both. Lady Harrington is being kept in protective custody at her Belgravia residence. Langford is cooperating fully." Holmes stepped back. "Then the process of justice may begin." Outside the interview room, the corridors had grown busier. Clerks hurried past with bundles of papers. Telephones rang in distant offices. The low murmur of voices filled the air. Lestrade escorted Holmes and Watson to the main hall, where the first reporters had already gathered, notebooks in hand. As they stepped into the pale sunlight of the yard courtyard, Holmes paused. The newspapers will have their sensation, he said quietly. But the truth is more important than the scandal. Harrington's reputation will be restored. He was a weak man who made grave mistakes. But in the end, he intended to confess everything and expose the conspiracy. For that he paid with his life. Watson placed a hand briefly on Holmes' shoulder. You've done more than most could have, Holmes. Justice will be served. Holmes gave a small, tight nod. Justice begins here, Watson. The rest is for the courts and for time. They walked toward the waiting hansom. The horse stamped impatiently, breath steaming in the cold air. The driver touched his cap as they climbed in. As the cab pulled away, the sounds of London rose around them, handsome wheels on stone, the cries of street vendors, the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hour. The winter sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of frost. Inside the cab, Holmes sat in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke, almost to himself. Evil wears many faces, Watson. Sometimes it wears the mask of a gentleman, sometimes of a diplomat, sometimes of a humble clerk. But it always leaves traces. And where there are traces, there is hope. Watson smiled faintly. And where there is hope, there is justice. The cab rattled on toward Baker Street. Behind them, the great machine of the law had begun to turn. Chapter 9. Light of vindication. The Old Bailey courtroom was hushed on the morning of the opening session. Pale winter light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the dark oak benches. The air smelled of polished wood, old paper, and the faint, lingering trace of coal smoke from the stoves that warmed the galleries. A low murmur ran through the public seats, reporters, clerks, and curious members of society who had secured tickets through influence or persistence. Sherlock Holmes sat in the witness box first. He gave his evidence with the calm precision of a man reciting a chemical formula. The forged suicide note was produced. The jury examined it under the direction of the clerk. Magnifying lens passed from hand to hand as Holmes explained the left-handed splatter pattern, the adulterated Prussian blue ink, and the telltale scar impression from Elias Thorne's thumb. The jute fibers, the tobacco ash samples, the continental gunpowder, the Latakia-tainted hair, all were presented methodically, each item sealed in glass or wax paper, each accompanied by Holmes' own laboratory reports. Sir Edmund Blackwood's counsel rose to cross-examine. Emma. Holmes, is it not possible that these traces were left innocently? A visitor's ash, a clerk's fiber, a diplomat's hair, surely such things are commonplace. Holmes regarded the barrister with cool detachment. Commonplace in isolation, perhaps, but not when 3 distinct foreign tobaccos appear in a room where only Cuban cigars were smoked, not when diplomatic gunpowder is found in a British pistol, not when a forger's scarred thumbprint is clearly visible on the blotting paper beneath a forged document. Coincidence stretches only so far, sir. Beyond that point it becomes conspiracy. The barrister sat down. Count Drakov's defense followed a different tactic. His counsel argued diplomatic immunity. The count sat impassive in the dock, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point. But when the ledger entries were read aloud, payment signed in his own hand for classified information, the murmur in the gallery rose sharply. The judge silenced it with a single rap of the gavel. Elias Thorne was the last to give evidence for the prosecution. Pale and trembling, he spoke in a low voice that carried clearly through the silent court. They said they would ruin me. Blackwood threatened exposure of my debts. The count said my family in Poland would suffer. I forged the note. I fired the shot. I never wanted murder, only to save myself. Lady Harrington was called next. She entered the box with quiet dignity, her mourning veil raised. Her voice was steady as she described her husband's growing distress in the months before his death. He spoke often of the colonial trade bill. He said there were men who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. In the last week, he told me he intended to make a full confession to the Prime Minister. He wanted to end the corruption. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. When she finished, the judge inclined his head in respect. Thank you, Lady Harrington. Your testimony is of the greatest importance. The defense cases were brief. Blackwood maintained his innocence, claiming the Turkish ash was accidental. Drakov invoked diplomatic privilege and refused to testify. Thorne's counsel pleaded coercion. The jury retired at 3:30. They returned after 4 hours. The foreman stood. On the charge of murder, we find Sir Edmund Blackwood guilty. Count Victor Drakov, guilty. Elias Thorne, guilty, with a strong recommendation to mercy on account of duress. The judge passed sentence the following day. Blackwood and Drakov received life imprisonment. Thorne was given 15 years, with the possibility of early release for cooperation. The diplomatic consequences were immediate. The Russian embassy issued a formal protest, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Drakov was quietly removed from the country under heavy guard. In the days that followed, the newspapers carried headlines that slowly shifted from scandal to vindication. The Times published a long editorial praising the courage of Lord Harrington in his final days. Lady Harrington's name was cleared completely. She received a private letter of condolence from the Prime Minister himself. Victor Langford's Expose, now stripped of its more sensational elements, appeared as a respected series on political corruption, earning him grudging respect in Fleet Street. At 221B Baker Street, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded on the stairs with the Morning Post. The coal fire burned steadily. The room smelled of shag tobacco, fresh ink, and the faint sweetness of her lemon cakes. Watson sat at the table, pen in hand, beginning the manuscript of yet another adventure. Holmes lounged in his armchair, violin resting across his knees, drawing a slow, contemplative bow across the strings. Watson looked up. "It's done, Holmes. The innocent are cleared. The guilty are punished. The truth is known." Holmes paused in his playing. Order is restored, Watson, at least for a time. The machine of justice grinds slowly, but it does grind. He set the violin aside and rose to stand by the window. Outside, the winter sun shone on the frost-covered rooftops of Baker Street. A hansom cab clattered past below, its wheels ringing on the cobbles. Holmes spoke quietly. "Lady Harrington has announced she will establish a small charitable fund in her husband's name, assistance for those ruined by debt and coercion. Langford has been offered a position on the Times editorial staff. Thorne's family will receive a modest pension from the government in recognition of his testimony. Small mercies, perhaps, but mercies nonetheless." Watson smiled. "And you, Holmes?" Holmes turned from the window. A faint, rare smile touched his lips. "I shall continue as I always have. There are other shadows in London, Watson, other webs to unravel." He crossed to the mantel and took down his pipe. The familiar ritual began again, the tamping, the lighting, the first long draw of smoke. Watson returned to his manuscript. The pen scratched softly across the page. Outside, the great city moved on. Gas lamps were lit against the early dusk. Hansom cabs rattled through the streets. The river flowed beneath its bridges, carrying the secrets and sins of men toward the sea. But in one small corner of Baker Street, for a little while at least, the world felt right again. Chapter 10. Reason's Quiet Triumph. The fire in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street burned low and steady that January evening. A soft orange glow spread across the familiar clutter. Stacks of newspapers, chemical apparatus half covered with dust sheets, the Stradivarius resting in its open case on the side table. The air carried the rich, comforting scent of shag tobacco from Holmes' pipe, mingled with the faint sweetness of Mrs. Hudson's lemon biscuit still warm from the oven. Outside, a light frost had settled on the rooftops. The window panes bore delicate patterns of ice that caught the firelight like scattered diamonds. Dr. Watson sat in his usual chair, legs stretched toward the hearth, a glass of hot brandy in his hand. The sweet warmth of the liquor lingered pleasantly on his tongue. Sherlock Holmes lounged opposite in his dressing gown, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in that rare state of perfect repose that followed the conclusion of a difficult case. The Morning Post had brought the final echoes of the Parliament Square affair. Lady Harrington had written a brief, dignified note of thanks. Victor Langford's series on political corruption had begun in the Times, earning measured praise even from those who once dismissed him. Elias Thorne's sentence had been quietly reduced further in recognition of his full cooperation. His family would not starve. Sir Edmund Blackwood and Count Victor Drakov remained in separate wings of Pentonville, their appeals already dismissed. Watson set the last letter aside. "It is finished, Holmes. All the strands are tied." Holmes opened his eyes. Finished, yes. Yet the mind returns to the method, as it always does. He rose slowly and began to pace the narrow space before the fire, slippers whispering over the worn carpet. This case, Watson, was a perfect illustration of the deductive art. The error of Scotland Yard, and indeed of almost every observer, was to accept the surface narrative. A man overwhelmed by guilt takes his own life, but the surface is the criminal's first deception. Beneath it lie the traces, the stubborn material traces that never lie. He stopped beside the mantel and took down a small glass vial containing a few flakes of gray ash. Turkish tobacco, one variety among the 140 I have catalogued in my monograph. Sir Edmund Blackwood's preferred blend. A single pinch in the wrong place betrayed him. Similarly, the Latakia hair on the window sill, Count Drakov's distinctive scent clung to it like a signature. And the jute fiber, coarse and unremarkable to most eyes, yet as distinctive as a fingerprint when matched to the document bag in Thorne's possession. Watson nodded, watching the firelight play across his friend's angular features. "You always say the smallest detail may hold the key." "And so it does," Holmes replied. The forged note itself was a masterpiece of deception, yet the left-handed splatter, the tacky ink in one corner, the scarred thumb impression on the blotting paper beneath, all spoke against it. When I examined the lock scratches, the microscopic metal filings still bright, I knew someone had entered after the murder. Each fact, taken alone, was trifling. Together they formed an unbreakable chain. He returned to his chair and sat, drawing deeply on his pipe. A plume of smoke curled upward toward the ceiling. "Compare this to the speckled band, Watson." There, too, the truth lay in material evidence. A bell rope that was not a bell rope. A ventilator that served no purpose. A saucer of milk beside a locked door. The criminal constructed an elaborate illusion of the supernatural. Here, the illusion was simpler suicide, but the principle was identical. Observe the physical facts. Eliminate the impossible. What remains is truth. Holmes leaned forward, voice lowering. Observation is not guesswork, Watson. It is disciplined attention to detail. Guesswork leaps. Observation measures. Deduction follows. The criminal mind, for all its cunning, is predictable in its patterns. Greed seeks concealment. Fear leaves haste. Ambition overreaches. These are constants. The clever villain may change the method, but he cannot change human nature. And where human nature acts, it leaves traces. He gestured toward the window where the frost glittered faintly. Look at London tonight. Thousands of gas lamps burning, thousands of lives intersecting in fog and shadow. Most crimes are crude, born of passion or desperation. But the great ones, the ones that threaten the state itself, are built on calculation. They require accomplices, forged documents, smuggled powder, diplomatic seals. Yet the more elaborate the machinery, the more points of failure. Every conspirator is a weak link. Every secret transaction leaves a receipt, a hair, an ash, a fiber. Watson smiled quietly. "And you find them all." "Not all," Holmes corrected, "but enough. And each success reinforces the method. Reason triumphs not because it is noble, but because it is inexorable. The criminal may outthink one man or 10. He cannot outthink logic itself." The fire settled with a soft crackle. Holmes set his pipe in the tray and took up the violin. He drew the bow once across the strings, a single, long, contemplative note that hung in the warm air. Watson watched him, feeling the deep contentment that comes at the end of a hard-won struggle. "You have given justice to a man who scarcely deserved it, Holmes, and you have exposed a corruption that might have spread much further." Holmes played another slow phrase, then lowered the instrument. "Justice is not about desert, Watson. It is about restoring order. A single murder left unsolved is a tear in the fabric. A conspiracy that reaches into the heart of government is a wound. We have stitched it closed for now." He rose and crossed to the window. For a moment he stood looking out at the frosted street. where a lone hansom cab moved slowly beneath the gas lamps, its wheels ringing faintly on the cobbles. Then he turned back, the faintest of smiles touching his lips. The supremacy of reason, Watson. That is the only certainty in a world of shadows. Men will lie, will scheme, will kill, but the facts remain. And where the facts are pursued without passion or prejudice, truth will always prevail. He returned to his chair and picked up his pipe once more. Watson lifted his glass in a small, silent toast. Outside, the great city slept beneath its blanket of frost. Inside 221B Baker Street, two old friends sat in companionable silence, the fire burning low, the night peaceful at last.